All right, welcome to the Unprofessionals Podcast. I'm Joshua Sutter, and this week I am privileged to be joined by Grant Hughes. Grant is an NBA national featured columnist at Bleacher Report, and you can find him on Twitter at GT_Hughes, and I'll put his Bleacher Report information in the blog post for this podcast and all of that good stuff. Grant, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I thought it would be really interesting to have you on after I've seen some of your pieces up on Bleacher Report, some of the recent ones, talking about Kobe and the Sixers, and specifically after the Warriors pulled the Jazz win out of their respective butts this past week. I thought it would be incredibly interesting to have you on after I read your piece on that, because I think that's one of the aspects of the Warriors season that's gone incredibly under discussed, is that they have these games that they have no business winning, and somehow just it's almost unexplainable that they somehow pulled that Jazz one out. When you pointed it out in your piece, the Jazz really dominated them in that game in terms of how they were playing, even though they had a bad free throw night, but they were dominating them in terms of how bad they wanted the game through the first 3.5 quarters, and then all of a sudden the Warriors pulled it out. So it's really just been incredible to watch them play. So what's it been like to kind of live near that team and not necessarily cover them, but they're your hometown team, so it's kind of hard not to be, drawn up in the hype?
Yeah, I mean, it's been surreal in a lot of ways, and the thing you mentioned about them winning games and continuing and repeatedly winning games that they seemingly don't have any business winning. To me, you sort of have to almost fall back on old cliches and stuff that I don't buy into normally, like the idea of something being clutch, like the concept of clutch actually existing, which I don't really subscribe to at all. But I'm going to do something at some point before the season's over on just chronicling the games that they really shouldn't have won. And just sort of going off the top of your head, you can find, a half dozen easily. And probably more. And certainly the Utah game was one of them. They shouldn't have won it. They got a little bit lucky. I mean, that's what you kind of have to look for in a lot of those instances. They've just been lucky in a lot of situations late in games. The free throw thing you mentioned, Derek Favors played 19 minutes in that game. He was really hugely important to Utah on both ends. So getting him out of there with a knee injury was lucky. But there is something also in addition to the luck or the idea of clutch that I think and I think that is really tied in really strongly to how great they are. They have a level that they can play at that no one else can reach. And so I think that helps explain why they can do this so consistently. And it also helps explain why the Spurs, for example, have a higher per game differential. They beat teams on average by more points. The Warriors coast, and I feel like they search for reasons to care, and they lose a little urgency sometimes, but they know that they can outplay anyone for a 5-minute stretch when they need to, and that gets them into trouble because they rely on that, but they just pull it out more often than not, and it's crazy to see. It really is.
And that kind of leads me into my next thing I wanted to discuss, which is something that I think that there haven't been enough pieces written on and really covered a ton, and partially because the Warriors are going to break the Bulls, fingers crossed, they're going to break the Bulls' single season win record, is that right now there are 2 teams in the NBA that have the chance to go undefeated at home, and that's never happened. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure the Celtics only lost 1 game in that famous year when they were almost undefeated at home. But how big of a deal would it be to go into the playoffs one against 2 in the Western Conference Finals and have both teams be undefeated at home? I can't really imagine the NBA Finals being better than a potential Western Conference Finals between the Spurs and the Warriors.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's a situation where the Western Conference Finals to me are the finals this year, and that's assuming the Spurs and Warriors get there, which all indications are that they will. The undefeated at home thing is just another in a series of sort of angles you can take on what the Warriors have done to this season. The Spurs, if not for the Warriors, we'd be talking about the Spurs as one of the, 5 or 6 greatest teams we've ever seen in a regular season. They're on pace to be better than the Warriors were last year. And certainly we said those things about the Warriors last year. So it will be hugely disappointing to me, and I think everybody, if something goes awry in these first couple of rounds and we don't see these two teams play a series. But it's just really difficult for me to imagine a scenario where they don't meet. And then, sorry to whoever comes out of the East, probably Cleveland, but I don't give the East representative really any chance in the finals. I'd be stunned if anyone from the East actually won it.
So you don't think there's a situation to where the Western Conference is just so brutal that, and this is kind of what we thought would happen last year, but the Spurs, lost in the first round of the Clippers. You don't think there's a scenario in which the Warriors or the Spurs are on the off chance, the Thunder, but most likely the Warriors or the Spurs, that they're so beat up after a 7-game series that potentially the Cavs or maybe Toronto could steal steal the first game in the Western Conference team's backyard and potentially have a shot to, pull off an upset?
Well, yeah, to me, that's the angle you'd have to take, right? If you're going to make that case, is that this idea of fatigue and surviving the West Gauntlet is going to sort of count for more than what I see as a pretty significant talent disparity in favor of whoever comes out of the West. It's just difficult for me. Certainly, if you take the Spurs as an example, as liberally as they've rested a lot of their guys, over the last couple of weeks, and as conscientious as they are about keeping players healthy, it's hard for me to see them wearing down. Although they've got some older players, so it's possible. And for the Warriors, I see them as being so much more talented than anyone that would come out of the East. Like if Andre Iguodala does not get healthy, that's a big deal. He's been out for a couple weeks. If Festus Ezeli is not back and able to contribute, he's been out for a couple months. That's an issue. Obviously, Curry, Thompson, Draymond, if those guys get hurt, that's different. And certainly you could say that some of the fatigue could factor into that. I just think the talent disparity is such that it may not matter if the West representative is tired, I guess is my answer.
No, that definitely makes sense. And I think something that's really cool to see with the Spurs this year is that I think they realized their mistake last year with resting guys. And obviously they're still resting guys and being the Spurs with how smart they're playing their lineups. But last year they didn't have the home court advantage against the Clippers, and that really came back to bite them. And I think it's really been interesting to see how Pop has adjusted his philosophy this year to still continually give guys rest, but also, they're 10 games above Oklahoma City right now for the 2 seed. So they're obviously going to have that. But I just think it's really been fascinating to watch Pop slowly twist his philosophy in a way that would enable them to get home court advantage, at least until the Western Conference Finals, which was one of their big, they obviously were, I think they were better than the Clippers last year, but they could have really used that Game 7 at home. And now they're going to have that in the first couple of rounds, which could potentially help them get past an OKC matchup, which everyone is labeling OKC as this amazing 3rd seed, one of the best of all time, along with like the Pistons in 2004. But do you actually think there's a scenario where OKC has a shot to get to the finals?
It's a tough question. To me, they are, and I have to be careful how I phrase this, they have some of the same elements as the Warriors do in a specific sense, which is that they have a level that they can reach sort of when everything is going right and they get the game at their pace and they sort of dictate the terms of the game, where they hit a level that, it's up there with almost anything anyone else can do. They're also, to me, a pretty deeply flawed team for all of the classic reasons that we have sort of used over the last few years. I could see them. I'll put it this way. If there's another team I have to pick to win a title, and this includes Cleveland, I would put Oklahoma City ahead of them and obviously behind the Warriors and Spurs, just because, they have 2 of the 5 best players in the league. They are able to just sort of overwhelm teams athletically still. So they've got a lot going for them. They still run into late game issues because they don't really have an offense. Their defense comes and goes. They live and die with Westbrook and Durant and very little ball movement. And that is an issue in a playoff series where smart teams have a lot of time to game plan. So if the question is, do they have a chance? Everybody's always got a chance. I just don't see it being a very big one, given the quality and sort of lack of weaknesses that the Warriors have.
Yeah, you mentioned deeply flawed, and I think that leads perfectly into the team in the East that everyone is heralding as the best team, and I think obviously they are. Fans in Toronto would argue, but the Cavs. And we thought perhaps the dysfunction that we saw last year was, a product of the first season of them being together, but now it's continued into April of 2016, and this weird air around that team doesn't seem to be going away. What's your sense on them? Do you actually think they can come together and be cohesive, which they did a little bit in the playoffs last year, and then, Kyrie and Love were obviously out, but is there some scenario in which the Cavaliers lose this shade of dysfunction that's surrounding them and can somehow pull together and reach the potential that we all hoped that they would reach?
It's funny. I think, so let's pretend we flash forward a couple of months and it has turned out that the Cavaliers got bounced in the second round. And I think if we flash forward to that, you can really see yourself kind of thinking or saying, yeah, okay, I buy that. They fell apart. The chemistry issues were real. Kyrie Irving just wasn't engaged. Kevin Love didn't have a role. LeBron looked unhappy. Like, I can imagine myself in a couple months saying, oh, it really did go that way. It did go south, kind of how it seemed like it might. At the same time, I just think that, they're going to be in the finals. That's the more likely scenario if we're imagining what it looks like in a couple months. And I think they have real problems. I think they don't like playing together. That's to me, if you're watching at all, that's pretty abundantly clear. They don't fit very well. LeBron, I think, it has a lot of holes as a leader. He's obvious. I think he's still the second best player in the league, just in terms of talent, but I don't know that I am convinced he's a great leader. So I think they'll be in the finals, but if it makes any sense, and if I can sort of hedge in this really, wishy-washy way, if it falls apart, I think we're all going to say like, yeah, I kind of saw that coming.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the aspect that has been interesting to me with the story that your fellow Bleacher Reporter writer Howard Beck did on LeBron and Carmelo, and that quote that was taken out at the end that was much covered along with the rest of the story, which was great. But the narrative has switched with the Cavaliers, and Kevin Love's not really the focus of the criticisms much anymore because, and it's kind of sad, but I feel like a lot of people have given up on him in terms of what they think of him as a player. And I think that's one of the most disappointing aspects to the way this Cavaliers venture over the last year and a half has gone, is that we saw a guy in Kevin Love who was unbelievable to watch in Minnesota and really talented. And I don't think he's lost that talent, but we've just kind of gone from criticizing him to criticizing the Cavs and then firing Blatt and say, oh, Tyronn Lue will fix this. And then, oh, his stats went up a little bit. Where are you on Kevin Love? Do you think that he can succeed in Cleveland? And if not, where do you think he can go to where he can recapture that, maybe he's the best player on a bad team kind of thing, but where are you with Kevin Love?
So I think obviously Kevin Love is still a very like net positive player. And I don't mean that as like a backhanded compliment. There aren't a lot of guys I think you could say in a vacuum are that. I do think, though, as you touched on it, I really think maybe that, he's the type of guy that he kind of needs to have the ball a lot to maximize his effectiveness. And that's really what he got in Minnesota. He was the total fulcrum of that offense. And if you're gonna sort of try to live with his defensive issues, you need to maximize what he does offensively. And that means he sort of needs to be your primary guy. He really isn't that great of a spot-up shooter. He's not that type of guy that you can use in the pick and roll that really draws defenses into the middle. They're not afraid of him on the move. So as a third wheel, it doesn't really maximize what he's good at, which is having the ball a lot, passing the ball, working at the elbows, sort of like a Marc Gasol kind of game, with the three-point shot. To me, he may be a guy that is the best player on a mediocre team. That may be what he is. It is a little distressing that given his other talents, the Cavs haven't figured out how to really get the most out of him or get more out of him. But I'll tell you what, if he's not on the Cavaliers next year, I won't be surprised. I would put it that way.
Yeah, neither would I, especially with all the weird trade rumors that are always surrounding him. Around the trade deadline, the Celtics, Danny Ainge hinted that there was a surprise move. And of course, people like us speculated beyond belief at, who that could be. And we've always kind of imagined Kevin Love moving to a scenario in which we can really see him succeed and thrive. And Boston was one of those teams that, we all speculated. But with the Cavs dysfunction, there's really this gap, and it's I kind of picture it kind of like the presidential election almost. Like the Democrats are having this fantastic gap because there's so much dysfunction on the Republican side, and there's a lot of dysfunction in the Cavs right now. So who's the team who can step up and perhaps take advantage of that, just as Hillary's taking advantage of the Trump situation? Is it just the Raptors, or is a team below that like the Hawks, the Heat, or the Hornets, and maybe even the Celtics? Who do you give the best shot to take advantage of the dysfunction in Cleveland?
That has been, I think, one of the hardest questions of this entire season. And the East, its depth of quality is significantly better than it was last year. And what's happened partly because of that is we've had sort of a carousel of teams that looked like the second best team in the conference and the biggest threat. Toronto's been in that position for a good chunk of the second half. And I think you probably start there, which is, uninteresting because they're the number 2 seed. So of course we're going to they've got the best chance. A team that I kind of like, that I still have questions about are the Heat. And maybe that's me wanting to see the Heat and the Cavs play in the conference finals. Actually, looking at the seeds, the seeds can still shift. I think that's still a possibility. I just think that, there's something about LeBron playing the Heat that to me would not only be interesting, but I feel like it might mess with him a little bit. And I think, just getting away from that kind of, storybook aspect of it, Miami has very quietly sort of settled on a really nice 8-man rotation. They were a great defensive team in the first half, and they've suddenly become like a really capable offensive team. And Hassan Whiteside off the bench has a lot to do with that. They're getting a lot from a rookie Josh Richardson, who suddenly turned into this great 3-point shooter, which is just vital for a Heat team that had no 3-point shooters. I can see the Heat being a problem. Do I think they're better than Toronto just on balance? I don't. And so to me, it's still got to be the Raptors. But again, it's just so hard for me to see any of those other teams in the East, doing more than taking a game or two, just because if we assume Cleveland sort of gets it together and leverages the talent advantage they have, I just don't know who can really compete in a meaningful way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you touched on a good point there in that even though the Raptors are the 2 seed, they're probably the team that's the best built to take them down. I think Kyle Lowry has a bit of Damian Lillard, freak scoring potential in him that could definitely go head to head with a Kyrie kind of situation. The first round matchups in the playoffs right now, looking at the seeds, there's not a ton that are interesting, right? There's the one that I was looking the most forward to was that I'm a Pistons fan, so I'm biased, but if the Pistons were in the 8 seed, potentially playing the Cavs at the 1, I think they were like 100 to 1 odds to reach the finals or something. And I thought about putting $5 down on that, but I was really excited to see the Pistons play the Cavs in the first round because of the rivalry they've had. And also the Pistons with Tobias Harris after the trade deadline, they kind of hit some rocky roads at first. Their defense suffered, their rotation suffered a little bit without Ilyasova and Brandon Jennings, but they've really come to, Tobias Harris has really grown under Van Gundy, and you pointed that out in one of your recent pieces, I believe. His points per game and his field goal percentage has increased, and even though I think they're playing the long game, the Pistons are with the way that they're building their team, I still thought that first round matchup would have been a little bit interesting. And besides that, there's not really a first round matchup that I'm looking forward to. So is that disappointing to you as an NBA fan that there's not really that sexy first round matchup to look forward to?
Yeah, a lot can still change, actually, especially at the bottom of the East. I think the Pistons are 1 spot up on the Pacers, off the top of my head.
They're 1 game up right now.
So that could still happen. And I will say, I think the Cavaliers will just bounce the Pacers. Indiana is to me just a total pushover, even though, they're going to win. They may finish the season a couple games above 500. I would say too that if we get a Detroit-Cleveland series, Van Gundy is going to drastically outcoach Tyronn Lue, and if that series gets tight and we start having to see adjustments and counters to the counters strategically, it's a good thing. I'll say this: it's a good thing Cleveland has a lot more talent than the Pistons do, because I don't feel like those two coaches are on equal footing. in the West, if we do get a Utah Golden State first round matchup, I would be interested. I think, we saw a lot on Wednesday of what the Jazz can do to bother the Warriors. Certainly much more than, say, Dallas or Houston, if one of those two teams finished in the 8th spot. Utah's tough. They're really well coached. They're big. They got a lot of guys that present matchup problems to the extent that anyone presents matchup problems for the Warriors. Derek Favors is just, if there is such a thing as a prototype for slowing Curry down, Favors really is kind of one of those guys because he's huge and he's really agile. So when he gets switched out onto Curry, it's tough. It's to the extent again that someone can make Curry work. Favors is a really interesting guy in that role. So that'd be a good one to see, I think, if we're talking 1 versus 8.
Yeah, and I think you look at the Western Conference, and you're right. The Utah Golden State one is definitely interesting. Potentially, Oklahoma City Portland is interesting, just because Dame has been so incredibly fascinating to watch since the All-Star break, and throughout his career he's been fun, but he's really been so entertaining to watch. If you look in the West, and right now the Oklahoma City Thunder are at 3 and the Clippers are at 4, and that's probably not going to change. In fact, I don't think it can change, but let's assume that the playoffs move as we think they will, and it's going to be Golden State in the Western Finals and then San Antonio in the Western Finals. Where do the Clippers and Oklahoma City go from here? Obviously, the Clippers just locked up DeAndre, and that situation is probably as good as it's going to get for him. He's succeeding with Chris Paul, obviously, but it seems like OKC and the Clippers are kind of hitting a wall. And if we assume that they don't proceed to the finals this year, where do both of those teams go from here?
Well, they're two very different questions. The Thunder, obviously, with Kevin Durant's free agency looming, their entire future will be dictated by him staying or going. I think he'll probably stay. And if he does, then I think they will be confident in just kind of running it back. And I think that's the way to go. It's just hard to get away from the Spurs and the Warriors sort of coloring the rest of the league. And sort of we judge everyone against that ridiculous, historically, great standard. The Thunder are really good. And in a normal year, I think they'd probably be a title favorite. So if they can sort of keep it together, regardless of what happens to them, in probably the second round, they should. And I think they probably will. The Clippers, we kind of thought that there was a lot of chatter last year after the way they, fell apart against Houston in a series. By the way, I still think the Clippers are the better team than the Rockets were. They just got really unlucky and ran out of gas because they didn't have a bench. The Clippers are kind of at a point again where it's like, well, what do we really think about this Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre core? Is this viable going forward, especially with sort of the way this year? You heard a lot of people say that, well, the Clippers don't need Griffin. I don't buy that. I think he's really good. I think he's valuable. They can find a way to use him. So for me, the Clippers are kind of in the same situation as last year, where they need to get better on the margins. They need better bench players. They need better backup bigs. They need someone who's not Jamal Crawford to, even though he scored 32 last night, to sort of run a sensible offense and actually guard his position behind Chris Paul. I feel like I'm always boring with what do these teams do questions, because if you're good, I kind of think you need to try to stay good and not reach for great, because that's how things can go wrong sometimes.
No, definitely. And you mentioned this at the beginning of your talking, but it's hard to really judge where OKC and the Clippers are, because you're right. In a normal year where two teams weren't, vying for 70 wins, and in the Warriors situation, vying for 73, they would be teams that everyone was talking about as, having a chance to win a title. But because of the way that the Spurs and the Warriors are playing, and also the way that both those teams are built for the future, the Clippers and the Thunder both seem kind of dysfunctional, and they seem like these situations of where like, oh, what can they do to get better? And it's like, well, the Thunder have 2 of the top 5 players in the league, and Ibaka's really good, and Donovan was shaky at the beginning of the season, but he's gotten better, and they're building a little bit better of a bench than they have had in years past. It's like they seem like they're doing things right, but at the same time, it's like, what can you do to compete with the best shooter in NBA history, and then Klay Thompson, one of the best shooters in NBA history already, and Draymond, this cyborg NBA machine who's unbelievable. And it's hard to compete with that. Like, you can't really necessarily go in free agency and, randomly strike gold. That's going to be something they're going to have to do in the draft. And it's also one of those things to where, I feel like Klay Thompson's always using the example of, well, you just got to wait for Klay to twist his ankle, or, if Klay twists his ankle, what happens? And I feel bad for him, but in all seriousness, like, a tweak of an ankle here and a, twist of a knee there, and all of a sudden it opens right up for the Thunder with all the talent they have, because in a 7-game series, they're going to have two of the best 3 players on the court with anyone they play against. And that's something that is scary. And, as we've seen in years past, if you have 2 of the 3 best players on the court, you have potential to win any series.
Yeah. And so that's a great point about, so to me, being historically great in terms of your quality, as far as the Warriors and Spurs go, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to continue to have historically great luck. And so the ankle sprain is just as likely for them as it is for any other mediocre or bad team. And we've seen it's funny. It came up, the narrative came up a little bit at the end of last year's finals, where people talked about, well, the Warriors were lucky that they ducked both, they had a bunch of matchups where guys were hurt in like every round, and they ducked Irving and Love in the finals. So everybody said, well, what if, or they weren't that good, or they didn't really, beat the slate that really would have tested them. That happens every year. It's across the league, and great teams get knocked down by injuries. Bad teams do. It's a matter of time, and we'll see it in these playoffs. There will be a series that's determined by an injury. If Toronto loses an early round series, it's going to be because Kyle Lowry's elbow is hurt, and he's having it drained, and he can't shoot right now. If the Spurs lose a series, it'll be because Kawhi Leonard, rolls an ankle or whatever. Those will be the reasons. So if you're the Thunder, you can look at your roster and say, well, as long as that doesn't happen to us, and maybe it happens to somebody else, I like our chances. And that applies to how they should approach free agency. That applies to how they should approach the playoffs. I think that applies to how they should approach their long-term future. You're not going to build a roster with 2 of the best 5 players on it, really ever. It's just hard to do, almost impossible. So if you're the Thunder, you hang out and you hope someone else gets unlucky, because certainly they've been unlucky in the past, and that might be enough for you. So it's just, the injuries are going to dictate this postseason, just like they do every one. And maybe the Thunder, break through for that reason.
And you talk about unlucky, they've been unlucky in the past. It's really unprecedented how unlucky they've been with the unbelievable talent they've had on their teams. As far as the best of the best, obviously we can sit here and nitpick their bench moves over the last, in the KD Russ era. But, for a couple moments, they had, James Harden, Serge Ibaka, Russell Westbrook, and Kevin Durant. And now, even without James Harden, they still have an unbelievable core of players. And, right now they're running against perhaps the best team in NBA history as far as their regular season performance. They ran against the LeBron Heat, which was a little mini dynasty in of its own. And it just seems like Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook just cannot catch a break. And I guess the best move for Kevin Durant, in my, humble opinion, obviously I'm not an NBA star, but it seems like there isn't really a better scenario for him than playing with Russell Westbrook and Serge Ibaka and just hoping that the cards are going to break right for them. Because going to like a big market like LA, even if they have the number 1 pick and they could, potentially get Ben Simmons, and Ben Simmons, turns out to be great and they have a great core. It's like, is that situation or any other situation around the league, the Celtics, the Heat, whatever, really better than playing with Russell Westbrook in Oklahoma City?
No, you're absolutely right. Of the team, there will be many teams with the money to pay him this summer, and really there aren't many that he will even seriously consider, if any. There is one move he can make if he wants to join more talent, and that's to play with the Warriors, and that's been floated a little bit. But to me, if I'm the Warrior, I've said this before, I've written this a handful of times, like that is not a cut and dried, no brainer decision to me, as insane as that sounds, to think about adding Kevin Durant.
Well, I don't think it's insane, because they're about to win 73 games this year. Like, you don't really want to mess with that. If you look at it one way, is it your position, Warriors, that you can do better than you just did?
And do you need to make a big swing and change your roster significantly to try to win 76 games? It's crazy. Kevin Durant could very well make them a lot better. I guess maybe I'm risk averse, and that's why I kind of want them to just stay the course and see how long this can last. As long as like Bogut and Iguodala are still, viable rotation guys as they get into their 30s, that's a concern. But yeah, I mean, if I'm Durant, I can't do better than the roster I have. And if he doesn't like his coach, which, we haven't heard any indications of that, that's a separate issue. If he's unhappy personally, that's another issue, but we haven't heard that. In terms of talent, he's kind of, it's crazy to say because, they're an outside shot to win the title at best, but he's kind of spoiled and he's not going to do a whole lot better realistically.
I want to talk a little bit about the Memphis Grizzlies. And you talked earlier about you would rather stay good than necessarily always aim to be great. And with Memphis, they're kind of the standard for me of, the mediocre team. Obviously, they've been really good in years past, and that's kind of, it's slipping a little bit as Zebo gets older and Gasol's hurt, and Conley's still really good, and Tony Allen's getting older, and they've never really had great shooting around them. If you're Memphis, would you stay good and average, winning 41, 42 games a year and, being the 4 and 5 seed and probably getting knocked out in the first or second round? Or I guess they can't really bottom out because they have Gasol, but would you, get rid of Zebo and let Conley go?
Well, so the Grizzlies are an interesting case, and I kind of rode them pretty hard before all the injuries, just because, roster wise, I like their pieces. I totally agree with you. I think Conley is a terrific player. I would hate to let him go, but he's going to be a free agent on a market this summer with very few top end guys. So, are you willing to invest max dollars in him as he gets past 30, and you're paying Gasol max dollars as with a foot injury, and he's a big guy and he's going past 30? That's risky. The problem with the Grizzlies for me, and this is less true now because they've changed how they play significantly since all these injuries happened, but they just fought tooth and nail against and resisted the stylistic changes that were, determining success in the NBA. They didn't shoot threes. They didn't push the pace. They played two conventional bigs a lot with Gasol and Randolph. And they just didn't really keep up with the times, for lack of a better term. And I think, it's crazy to think about, but in a really like a 3-year span, a refusal to embrace a ton of threes became so much more damning than it used to be. 3 years ago, you could sort of get away with it, but the Warriors basically played them off the floor last year after they figured it out, because Memphis just couldn't knock down threes. Specifically Tony Allen, who actually is shooting like 40% or something crazy like that this year from three on like a small number of attempts. The Grizzlies need to change, I think. They've got Gasol locked in, and I really like him. He's probably my favorite center in the league. But they've got to get faster. They've got to get better shooting, which is hard because that's what everybody wants. But they need to change that roster, because I think it's not a question of, well, they're good, can they stay that way instead of going for great? I think they are at risk of just not being good anymore if they don't make significant changes.
Which is almost worse than making the changes preemptively, is going down with the ship. There's always, something kind of narrative feeling about that as you go down with what you believe in or whatever. But going down with what you believe in the NBA will cost you more long-term as opposed to preemptively planning out your rebuild. And speaking of rebuilding teams, one of your recent pieces was talking about the 76ers and the process. What are your thoughts on the Sixers? Because there's a lot of, varying opinions on what they've done and what they're doing. But do you think it's working? And 2, do you think they should stick with the process?
I'll go with the second question first. I think, yes, they should stick with the process. And because to me, the is it working question, it matters, right? It matters what the results are, but the results haven't been good, partly because they've been unlucky with the way the ping pong balls have gone in the lottery, partly because they've been unlucky with injuries. But the theory behind what they're doing to me is still sound. And it's not any different than it was when they started. So I think I totally get the human element of it. I think they underestimated how hard it was going to be to do this and keep NBA players like engaged and let alone attract free agents eventually, which is like phase 2 of the process that they're not even close to being in. Just, we fixate on the horrible losses and the tanking and all that stuff, and I've written this a handful of times, rebuilds, like legitimate rebuilds, take a long time. And you look at like the Knicks and the Lakers, their playoff droughts are as long as the Sixers. The Kings have been out of the playoffs forever. And if you want to talk about a flawed process, the Kings are the absolute pinnacle of that. So if you're the Sixers, I think giving up on what they're doing at this juncture, which really in terms of a rebuild is an early juncture, is a huge mistake, and sort of like, it's not cowardly, but it would be bending to sort of the narratives that the media is spinning and all this stuff about, like, this being an embarrassment and this not working. It's crazy, but it's too early to say it's not working. And anyway, I think you judge the process on its logic and not on the results it gets over a short span of time. I could go on forever about this, just because I think the kind of thinking that they're employing is just so logical and makes so much sense objectively. And it's like these emotional reactions to it that are potentially threatening it, becoming a model or working out. I believe in what the Sixers are doing. And I may continue to believe in it, even if it keeps not working, just because I think it makes sense.
You're definitely right. It does make logical sense. And you also mentioned emotion. And that's the difficult balance with running an NBA team and figuring out the philosophical approach as to how you're going to manage players and how you're going to recruit players and all that stuff. So I think it's a little different, obviously, because, you and I aren't massive 76ers fans, but where do you balance, you don't want to, ruin your fan base. And right now, obviously there are diehard Sixers fans, but they're a very unattractive team to root for because, yes, you can say like, yes, it's logically sound. It makes sense. This is great for the future of our team. I'm not going to buy season tickets to go watch them play. So is that a concern, or should you just purely make decisions based off of logic, or is there a point where that ends?
Well, it's tough because, so I think maybe this means I have too much faith in people because in terms of, and this is a great way to just be wrong about everything, is to trust in people being generally smart and logical. If you're a Sixers fan and you sit and think about it, and maybe you don't want to do that with your sports team. Maybe that's not what sports is for. And I think maybe perhaps I'm underestimating sort of what people want out of their sports teams. They want it to be fun. They want it to be sort of this turn your brain off experience. It's entertainment. But if we pretend for a second that a Sixers fan could be objective about it, he would have to count himself in much better position than a Kings fan, right? If you're a Kings fan, you have to see this nonsense that's been going on, for 10 years.
So if you're the fan of an NBA team, would you rather, and I think I know my answer to this, but I'm interested to hear yours, is that would you rather be the, consistently, 6, 7, 8 seed and you're always getting playoff action, but you're, usually getting swept out of the first round? Is that more enjoyable for a fan than, I guess, the fingers crossing of the ping pong balls and, hoping you get that number 1 pick? And then if you get that number 1 pick, hoping he pans out 3 years from now, like, where is the best situation for an NBA fan to be out of those two teams? And I say fan because I think that's important to think emotionally, because obviously logically there's not really a comparison there. You want the team that has the potential to get the number 1 pick and then the draft pick. But if that's perpetual, and I'm just purely speaking to your emotional side as a basketball fan, if you're rooting for a team, is there a point where you like, yeah, I'd, be fine being the 8 seed a couple years in a row and getting to see, my team in the playoffs?
I'm weirdly sort of one of the worst people to ask about this, because my fandom is tied to the Warriors, and the Warriors have really, in my lifetime, they have been horrible or now really good. And so I've never really experienced the 6, 7, 8 seed treadmill thing. So I have to sort of speculate. But emotionally, I think if you're a fan, you probably do want, and now it's one thing if you're a playoff team, 6, 7, 8 seed, a few years in a row. I think you take that over the lottery stuff for a handful of years in a row. I do think though that it's weird. It's hard to know what fans really want, right? Because if you're one of those teams that is, kind of hanging around 500 and maybe making the playoffs and maybe not, fans always get disgruntled with those teams, and they want to fire the coach and they want to take a step forward. Like, I guarantee that's exactly what's going to happen with the Wizards this summer. But just sort of, in general, I think you're probably right. I think as a fan, you want the games to matter. And certainly now, if you're a Sixers fan, none of your games matter. If you're a Jazz fan, a Rockets fan, just talking this year, a Bulls fan, a Wizards fan, whatever, and you're in the mix for a playoff seed, even if you're not necessarily in position, it's probably better than just like hoping your team loses, because that's the logical thing to hope for in those lottery situations.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Rockets and the Wizards, two of the teams that had, decently high expectations, and then both have obviously, failed massively. But I want to talk specifically about the Rockets. I know I was certainly surprised by their playoff success last year, and I think there were a few teams that got knocked out earlier than them that I personally thought were better than them, but you can't argue the results. And the results were there, and that, going into this season, they were one of the favorites in the West. Did success kill the Rockets?
I think it's a combination of that and the first thing you said, which is there were better teams than them in the West. I think, based on their differentials and some of their advanced metrics from last year, they were not what their record suggested they were. They were a little bit lucky in the playoffs, and really were more like, realistically, they probably should have been projected as like a 6 or 7 seed this year, maybe 5. But I think what happened is, like you mentioned, they got a little success. And I think some of the personalities on that team are not necessarily disposed to taking the offseason seriously. And they just really, have fallen short of what even, what the limited expectations we should have had. So to me, it's a combination. They weren't as good as people thought they were. And then maybe they thought that they were as good as they were, and they went a little easy over the summer. And now, those things can kind of spiral. And I think, with Harden and Howard as your sort of locker room leaders, there's a pretty low ceiling on how far you're going to get, long-term sustainably. You might have a spike like last year, but that's not a steady foundation or sturdy foundation to build around, in my mind.
Speaking of foundations that are crumbling, you wrote recently about Kobe Bryant, and this is the last thing I want to touch on. Has the Kobe farewell tour disappointed you in that? It's disappointed me a little bit, because I get what he's doing, right? He wants to clean up his image. He's being, nice guy Kobe, talking about his great relationship with guys. The one I found extremely comical was the whole Pau Gasol thing. And I get those guys were close at the end, but there were some moments in their early relationship when it was a little dicey. And so,
to say the least.
Yeah, to say the least. And so I think the entire thing, it's obviously a spectacle. And I got it with Jeter, but this obviously isn't the Kobe Bryant who, people like me and you, watched and loved. And I think there are a certain faction of people who will enjoy this Kobe. But for me, the Kobe I enjoyed was the killer Kobe, right? The bitter Kobe. And there's a line between, being graceful on your way out and losing who you are. I think we look at, the definition of the bitter superstar, and I guess, that's Michael Jordan for better or worse. And he was like this step above of what I would have hoped for, his Hall of Fame speech, he's calling people out, and it was a little far. So maybe, Kobe doesn't have to go all the way there, but he's gone to the reverse side of it, where he's just like this Kobe Bryant who I'm like, who is this guy? And he, and I get the Lakers are bad, but it's just a different Kobe, and he could go out gracefully while still being himself. But it's like his entire persona and on-court playing style have just meshed this weird, just like nice Kobe. Have you liked this, or is this just something that you've just kind of accepted and you've moved past?
I have this is the most fascinating individual story of the season to me. I could talk about Kobe forever, and I've never been a Kobe fan necessarily. So the first thing I'll say is I have always thought that Kobe is kind of like Tom Cruise in a way, and you have to sort of just hang on for a second. I feel like both of them act as how do I want to put this? They think to themselves all the time, how would a human being act in this situation? I will act that way. Like, that's the process to me that dictates how they conduct themselves.
Oh, this is the Marco Rubio syndrome.
Yeah. I think you can almost see the wheels turning sometimes, but they get really good at it. And then they just continue to act in what they would say, like if they're aliens from outer space and they come down and they say, I've observed humans acting in this situation, I will act that way. And Kobe obviously picked a specific guy to act like, and that's Jordan, down to the mannerisms and the tone of his voice and everything like that. But at the same time, I think the killer Kobe was much closer to whatever real person he is. I think that was genuine to me. What he is now feels really disingenuous. This is not him. And it seems crass to talk about it that way, because shouldn't we want people to mature as they get older, and shouldn't we want people to soften and have perspective and appreciate things? And the answer is, yeah, we should want that. But I don't think that's real Kobe. I just don't. I think this is him, and I wrote this. I think this is almost like a bully getting punched, and suddenly the light goes out of the bully, and he's not a bully anymore. He can't be. Something has been stripped from him. That's kind of what Kobe feels like to me this year. He's being, nice. He's being encouraging to players, opponents, and teammates, and all these things. And he's waving to the crowd, and like this just. We've created this false history where everybody hated Kobe. If your team played Kobe, you hated him. Maybe you respected him, and maybe that's really what this is. But we've all bought into this, and he's really played it well. But it doesn't seem real to me. And I would have preferred he go out, like he was all the time. And maybe he tried that early this year, and he realized he was so bad that he just couldn't. And it looked like it was like a tragic comic type of scenario. But I guess my short answer is no. I do not like how this is ending for him. It's disappointing, and it just seems really, really put on and fake to me.
No, I think that's well put. And we're going to try to exit this podcast a little more gracefully than Kobe's exiting his NBA career. And so thank you for doing this. I'm going to put your user, your profile and all that stuff in the bio for this so everyone can look up your stuff. What are you working on in the next couple of weeks leading up to the playoffs?
I'm probably going to be covering on site a couple of Warriors games next week as they get closer to 73. And after that, we'll start ramping stuff up and really kind of digging into some playoff predictions and kind of really sticking with a lot of Warriors stuff just because, you got to do it if they're on pace to do something no one's ever done before.
No, exactly. And that's going to be incredibly interesting to read, and I'm sure incredibly enjoyable for you to get to cover your hometown team. So, Grant Hughes, thank you for joining us, and thanks to everyone for listening to the Unprofessionals Podcast. You guys check us out on Twitter, all that stuff, and subscribe on iTunes. So thank you for listening, and have a good one.